Emma, a struggling store worker barely able to afford her rent, gave a shivering homeless man a coat during a brutal winter evening, never knowing he was a former Army veteran. An hour later, 4 Army trucks loaded with soldiers arrived at the store. Life was about to surprise her in the most unexpected way. Hello everyone, welcome to Narrative Whispers. Today I'm going to share another heartwarming story, so let's dive into it. Emma clutched her jacket tighter as she walked through the dimly lit streets of the city, her fingers numb despite being shoved deep into her pockets. The cold gnawed at her, seeping through every thread of her thin clothes. She shivered, her breath curling into white mist, but she kept walking. She had no choice. Her boots, soles worn down from months of overuse, crunched against the icy sidewalk as she made her way to work. Miller's department store wasn't far, just a few blocks from her tiny apartment, if you could even call it that. The place was barely bigger than a closet, with cracked walls, flickering lights, and a heater that rattled and sputtered more than it actually worked. But it was home, at least for now. Emma had only started working at Miller's 2 weeks ago, and even though the pay was low and the hours long, she was grateful. It was the first bit of stability she'd had in months. After losing her last job when the cafe she worked at shut down, she'd spent weeks surviving on instant noodles, skipping meals to make her food stretch longer, and worrying every single night about eviction. The rent was still overdue. Her landlord was losing patience, and her electricity bill loomed over her like a storm cloud. But at least she had a job again. She clung to that small victory like a lifeline. As she reached the store's glass doors, she wiped her damp hands on her jeans and stepped inside, the warmth hitting her like a soft wave. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, bright and almost too harsh after the dim streets. "Morning, Emma," called Sam, her co-worker, from behind the register. He was a cheerful guy in his early 20s with messy hair and a permanent grin. "Morning, Sam," she replied, forcing a smile. "Early shift again?" he asked, counting the cash in the till. Emma nodded as she hung her coat in the back room. "Yeah, trying to get as many hours as I can." Sam shot her a knowing look. "Still struggling with rent?" She hesitated. A little. A little was an understatement, but she didn't want pity. She wasn't looking for a handout. She just wanted to get through this, one paycheck at a time. The store opened, and Emma lost herself in work. She straightened racks of sweaters, folded jeans, organized shelves, and helped customers find their sizes. The hours dragged, but she didn't mind. Keeping busy distracted her from the gnawing anxiety that followed her everywhere. It wasn't until late afternoon, during a lull in foot traffic, that Emma noticed him. The man stood just outside the store entrance, huddled against the wall. His coat was thin and tattered, barely hanging together, and his shoes looked like they'd fall apart at any moment. His face, lined with age and hardship, was red from the cold, and his hands shook as he tried to warm them by blowing into his fingers. Emma's heart clenched. He wasn't begging. He wasn't bothering anyone. He just stood there, looking into the store windows with a quiet, tired longing. Without thinking, Emma grabbed a folded coat from the clearance section, a thick, insulated jacket that had been marked down after the holiday sales. She draped it over her arm and headed toward the door. As she stepped outside, the cold hit her like a slap, but she ignored it. "Hi there," she said gently. "Are you okay?" The man flinched, startled. His eyes, dull and weary, flicked up to meet hers. His face was weathered, lined with years of hardship, and his hands, cracked and raw, clutched his thin shirt as he shivered. "Oh," he mumbled. I'm fine, miss. Don't mind me." Emma's chest tightened. She'd seen enough hardship in her own life to recognize someone barely hanging on. "You look cold," she said, holding out the coat. "Here, take this." The man's eyes widened, and he instinctively took a step back, shaking his head. No, he muttered, waving his hands. "I can't take that. It's yours." Emma stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. Please, it's okay. I want you to have it. The man's lips quivered as he glanced at the coat, then back at her. Why? He whispered, voice barely audible. Why would you do that for me? Emma swallowed, her throat tight. Because everyone deserves to be warm, she said. And sometimes we all need a little kindness. Tears welled up in the man's eyes as he carefully took the coat, holding it as if it were made of glass. He slipped it on, the fabric slightly too big but wrapping around him like a shield against the cold. Thank you, he choked out, wiping his face with his sleeve. I don't know what to say. Emma smiled through her own tears. You don't have to say anything. Just then, the door behind her swung open with a harsh clang. Emma? She froze. It was Mr. Calloway, the store manager. His sharp gaze darted between her and the man, his face darkening like a storm cloud. What the hell is going on here? He snapped, stepping outside. Why are you talking to him? Emma straightened, her heart pounding. I gave him a jacket, she admitted, her voice small. Calloway's eyes flared. You gave him a jacket? From the store? Emma hesitated but nodded. It was on clearance. I was going to pay for it myself. Calloway let out a cold laugh, shaking his head. You think this is some kind of charity? We don't hand out clothes to every dirty stray who shows up outside. The homeless man flinched, his shoulders hunching like he was trying to disappear. Emma stepped in front of him, her hands trembling. He's not a stray, she said, her voice shaking. He's a person. Calloway sneered. A person who probably hasn't showered in months. He crossed his arms. And now you've cost yourself your job. Calloway's face hardened, his voice like ice. You're fired. Emma blinked, her breath catching. What? You heard me, he said, brushing imaginary dust off his sleeve as if the very presence of the homeless man dirtied him. You want to play the savior? Fine. Do whatever charity you want, just not on my paycheck. Emma stepped forward, her hands clasped together as her voice cracked. Please, Mr. Calloway, I need this job. I was going to pay for the jacket myself. It won't happen again. Just don't do this. Calloway smirked, already turning back toward the store. Not my problem. The homeless man's eyes widened, panic flooding his face. No, he croaked, stepping forward. Please don't do this. I'll give the jacket back. He started tugging the coat off, his fingers fumbling with the zipper. Calloway took a step back, grimacing. Keep it. I'm not touching that. It's ruined now. The man's hands froze, and he looked down, shame washing over him like a tidal wave. Emma's voice cracked. You don't have to do this, she pleaded with Calloway. I can pay for the jacket. Just don't punish him for my choice. Calloway's lip curled. Punish him? He barked a laugh. He should be grateful I'm not calling the cops. Now get lost from here. She tried one last time, her voice trembling. I'm begging you. Please. I really need this job. He paused at the door, looking over his shoulder with a cruel glint in his eye. Then beg somewhere else. And with that, he disappeared inside, the door slamming shut behind him. Emma stood there, her entire body shaking. The crowd that had gathered watched with morbid curiosity, their faces flickering with judgment, pity, and detachment, as if they were watching a scene from a play rather than someone's life falling apart. A woman whispered to her companion, Can you believe that? Another man muttered, She should have just minded her business. The homeless man stood frozen, the floor sliding from beneath his feet. His lips parted as he tried to form words, but nothing came out. The weight of what had just happened crushed him like a boulder. They fired you, he rasped, his voice barely audible. For helping me? Emma couldn't speak. She just shook her head, tears streaming down her face as the man stared at her, unable to process the cruelty of the world he'd just witnessed. She turned and walked away, her legs heavy like lead. The cold wind sliced through her thin clothes, but she didn't feel it. Her body moved on autopilot, carrying her farther from the store, her heart shattering with every step. The streets blurred as she trudged toward home, but after a while, the ache in her chest grew too heavy to bear. She reached a small park, barely making it to a worn wooden bench before collapsing onto it, and she cried. Her body shook with sobs, years of hardship pouring out all at once. The exhaustion of struggling to pay rent, the weight of barely affording food, the fragile hope that this job would finally bring stability. All of it crumbled into dust. She covered her face with her hands and wept, her tears soaking her fingers as her chest heaved. The world felt impossibly vast, and she felt so small. 10 minutes passed, maybe more. She lost track of time, lost in her despair. Then, she felt someone sit beside her. Emma looked up, her eyes swollen and red. The homeless man was there, clutching the coat she'd given him like it was the only thing tethering him to the earth. He didn't speak right away. He just sat there, his presence quiet and steady, as if he were keeping vigil for her grief. After a while, he finally broke the silence. "I followed you," he said softly. I didn't want you to be alone." Emma wiped her face with her sleeve, sniffing. "Why?" Her voice barely above a whisper. He gave a sad smile. "Because you didn't leave me alone." She let out a shaky breath, her throat raw. "Don't bother. You don't have to do this." She paused for a second and said, "But thanks. He glanced down at his hands, ashamed. "It's Daniel," he murmured. "Daniel Carter." Emma nodded, trying to steady her breathing. "I'm Emma." "I know," he said, his voice gentle. "I heard the manager yell it at you." That made her laugh, a broken, hollow sound that quickly turned back into tears. She shook her head, pressing her palms against her face. "I can't believe this happened," she whispered, her words muffled. "I was finally starting to get back on my feet, and now it's all gone. Just gone." Daniel stared ahead at the streetlights flickering on as dusk settled in, his expression distant. "That's how it feels," he said quietly. "When you lose everything." Emma turned to look at him, her heart aching even more. "I used to have a life," he continued, his voice rasping as if dragging each word out hurt. "A family, a home. I served in the army for 10 years, but when I came back, things weren't the same. I lost people, lost myself." Emma swallowed hard, listening. "I couldn't keep a job. My wife, she tried to help, but I was too messed up. I pushed her away, and eventually I lost her too." He rubbed his face, his fingers trembling. "One day I just stopped trying, and I've been out here ever since." Emma's chest tightened. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Daniel gave her a weak smile. "You don't need to be. You already did more for me today than anyone has in years." Emma looked down at her lap, her fingers twisting together. It wasn't enough. Daniel shook his head. It was everything. They sat in silence for a long while, the cold air wrapping around them. But somehow, it didn't feel as biting as before. After a while, Daniel cleared his throat. "You know," he said, glancing at her, "just because that man fired you doesn't mean what you did was wrong." Emma let out a shaky breath, her eyes filling again. "It doesn't matter, 'cause people don't value such things anymore," she whispered. "I still lost my job." Daniel tilted his head. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe you just changed someone's life." Emma looked at him, her eyes searching his face. And for the first time since she'd walked out of that store, she didn't feel entirely broken. Emma and Daniel sat in silence for a long while. The cold settled into their bones, but neither of them moved. The world carried on around them. People passed by without a glance, cars sped along the streets, and life continued as if nothing had happened. But for them, everything had changed. Eventually, Emma stood up, wiping her face. I should go home, she whispered. Daniel nodded. Do you have food or heat? Emma forced a weak smile. I'll figure it out. He hesitated, rubbing his hands together. I can't give you much, but you can have my coat back. Emma's heart shattered all over again. She shook her head. You need it. Please keep it. Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but he saw the exhaustion in her eyes and fell silent. They parted ways, Emma trudging home through the icy streets, her feet aching, her chest hollow. She collapsed onto her bed without bothering to change, wrapping herself in her thin blanket, and stared at the cracked ceiling until she drifted into restless sleep. The next morning, Emma woke to a loud knocking. Her body ached as she dragged herself to the door, expecting her landlord with another eviction threat. But when she opened it, her heart nearly stopped. Daniel stood there, and behind him, 3 massive army trucks filled with soldiers. Emma blinked, convinced she was dreaming. Whoa, what is this? Daniel smiled, standing straighter than he had the night before. I made some calls. Before Emma could respond, one of the soldiers stepped forward and saluted Daniel. Sir, we were informed of the situation, and we couldn't just ignore it, the soldier said, then turned to Emma. We came to help. Emma's hands flew to her mouth. Help! Daniel nodded, his eyes glistening. I served with these guys. They're my brothers. And when I told them about you, they wanted to show you the kindness you showed me. Emma's legs nearly gave out. One soldier stepped forward with a grocery bag full of essentials. Another carried a space heater. A third handed her an envelope, cash pooled together by the soldiers. Emma burst into tears. You didn't have to do this, she cried. We did, Daniel said, voice steady. Because what you did for me, that's the kind of kindness that changes the world. And you deserve the same kindness back. Now please, I want you to come with me. I have to make some things right. Emma first hesitated, and then she agreed. An hour later, the army trucks rolled through the city and parked in front of Miller's department store. Soldiers climbed out, lining up with rigid discipline, their uniforms crisp and boots thudding against the pavement like thunder. Daniel, now wearing the jacket Emma had given him with quiet pride, led the way inside. Emma followed, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. Inside, Mr. Calloway's face drained of color the moment he saw them. What is this? He stammered, stepping back from the counter. Daniel stepped forward. His voice, calm but unyielding, echoed through the store like a command. This woman lost her job because she helped someone, he said, and that someone happened to be me, a veteran who served this country. Calloway's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. She gave me warmth when the world gave me nothing, Daniel continued, his voice rising, and you punished her for it. The soldiers didn't say a word, but their presence alone spoke volumes. Customers had stopped browsing and were watching the confrontation unfold, their curiosity turning to quiet judgment against Calloway. The manager's gaze darted around nervously. I didn't know he was a veteran, he muttered. Emma, standing at Daniel's side, finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. Would it have made a difference? Calloway swallowed, his hands shaking. I was just following store policy. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice, but the intensity in his words filled the room. Policy? Daniel's voice cracked. Is your policy to judge people by how they look? To treat people like dirt unless they have a title or fame? Calloway flinched, but Daniel didn't stop. What if I wasn't a veteran? He continued, voice rising. Would that make it okay to humiliate me? Would it make it okay to fire her? He pointed at Emma, who stood with tears brimming in her eyes. The crowd watching grew silent, hanging on every word. A woman who has nothing still gave me something, Daniel said, his voice trembling. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't care about my past. She cared that I was cold. She cared that I was human. Emma wiped her face, her body shaking. Daniel took a shaky breath, his hands clenching. If someone like Emma, struggling just as much as I am, can find kindness in her heart, why can't you? Why can't store owners or managers like you leave just a little space in your hearts to help people? Calloway looked like he wanted to disappear, his face pale, his eyes darting to the floor. It was okay that you disrespected me, Daniel finished, voice soft but piercing. But it was not okay that you fired her. Calloway's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, his hands gripping the counter so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked at the soldiers, at Daniel, and finally at Emma, the young woman he had fired without a second thought, now standing with her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes swollen from crying. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, he turned and walked quickly to his office, his footsteps echoing in the dead silence of the store. Inside the small office, Calloway collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. His pulse pounded in his temples, and his chest ached with a weight he didn't know how to carry. He thought about the words Daniel had said. If someone like Emma, struggling just as much as I am, can find kindness in her heart, why can't you? The words cut deeper than any insult could have. Calloway let out a shaky breath, glancing at the framed certificates and awards on his wall, meaningless now, each one a reminder of how far he'd strayed from being a decent human being. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a resignation form, and stared at it for a long time. His hand trembled as he picked up a pen and signed his name at the bottom. But he wasn't done. He grabbed another sheet of paper and wrote a letter. A long one. When he finally emerged from the office, his eyes were red and his shoulders slumped as if he were carrying a mountain of guilt. Calloway walked straight up to Emma and handed her the letter. "This is for you," he whispered. Emma cautiously unfolded the paper, her breath hitching as she read, "I'm sorry for everything. I failed as a leader and as a human being. You are the kind of person who should run this store, someone with empathy, heart, and courage. I'm resigning, and I've recommended you as my replacement. The job is yours, if you'll accept it. Calloway." Emma's hands shook as she read the words over and over, her chest tightening. But then Calloway turned to Daniel, swallowing hard. "I owe you an apology, too," he said, voice rough. "I disrespected you, and there's no excuse for that. It doesn't matter who you are or what your circumstances are. You deserved kindness, and I denied you that." Daniel, his eyes glassy, nodded slowly. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said quietly. Calloway's throat bobbed as he swallowed the lump in his throat. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The store remained silent for a beat, and then one of the soldiers stepped forward and clapped. Another joined, then another. Soon, the whole store echoed with applause. Emma stood frozen, overwhelmed, tears rolling down her face as Daniel gently squeezed her shoulder. "I told you," he whispered, voice soft but steady. "You changed someone's life." Weeks later, Emma stood behind the front counter of Miller's department store, her name now displayed proudly on a plaque. Store manager, Emma Carter. The store had changed. Emma had implemented a policy where people in need could receive clothing donations from an Acts of Kindness section, and the soldiers who had come to her aid returned every month to help stock and organize it. Daniel became a regular fixture at the store, volunteering to help and slowly rebuilding his life. Emma even helped him reconnect with a local veterans support group, and little by little, he started to heal. One evening, as the store quieted, Daniel lingered by the counter. Emma looked up from her paperwork and smiled. "Heading out?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, but I wanted to say thank you. Again." Emma tilted her head, her smile soft. "For what?" "For saving me," he said quietly. "That day, I don't think I would have made it through the night." Emma felt her throat tighten. She reached over the counter and squeezed his hand. "You saved me too," she whispered. For the first time, they both believed it, and it proved that just a small act of kindness can create bonds that are never seen and never hoped. The purest bonds ever. Thank you for listening to this story. If you like it, please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story of Narrative Whispers.